The chandeliers of the grand ballroom at the Metropolitan Museum of Art dripped light, a crystalline rain that fell upon the city's gilded class. Each facet scattered the glow, illuminating the taut smiles, the discreetly appraised jewels, and the predatory patience in the eyes of men who measured their worth in billions. To Dorothy Washington, the light was an interrogator's lamp, harsh and unforgiving. The air, thick with the scent of hothouse lilies and expensive perfume, felt like a suffocating blanket. She called it the scent of curated power, a fragrance designed to choke out the memory of anything that existed before money. Once, she had breathed this air as if it were her own. Once, these galas had been the backdrop to her life with Robert, a life of effortless influence and quiet philanthropy. Now, she was a ghost at the feast, a cautionary tale whispered over champagne flutes that chimed like tiny, indifferent alarm bells. Her fall from grace had been swift, total, and brutally public. Tonight, she was here, not as a guest, but as a specter, having procured a ticket through the last shred of goodwill from an old acquaintance who probably pitied her. She wore a simple black dress, elegant, but a decade out of style. Her only jewelry the thin gold band on her left hand. It was an anchor in a storm that had passed, a reminder of the life that had been stolen. Her gaze was fixed on the man at the podium, James Eagle Morrison. The name was a brand, a myth meticulously crafted and sold to the American public. A decorated war hero turned visionary billionaire. His face was a portrait of rugged charisma, a square jaw, eyes the color of a winter sky, and a smile that could disarm senators and secure hostile takeovers with equal ease. Tonight, he was the guest of honor, the benevolent titan accepting the museum's Philanthropist of the Year award. The irony was a blade twisting in Dorothy's gut. Morrison spoke with the practiced cadence of a man who knew his words, moved markets, and shaped opinions. He spoke of duty, of service, of giving back to the country that had given him everything. His voice was a smooth, deep baritone, the kind that made people believe in things they knew, deep down, weren't true. Dorothy listened, her expression a mask of polite indifference. Inside, a cold, quiet engine of fury hummed. As he neared the end of his speech, his eyes swept the room, a king surveying his court. Then they found her. They stopped. For a fractional second, the practiced warmth in his gaze vanished, replaced by a flicker of something ancient and triumphant. A predatory smile touched his lips. He paused, letting the silence hang in the air. "Responsibility," he said, his voice dropping slightly, becoming more intimate, drawing the audience in, "is a heavy burden. It's about making the hard choices, the ones that others can't or won't. It's about understanding that sometimes, for the greater good, things of value must be cleared away, like clearing deadwood from a forest to allow new growth. It's a tragedy, of course, especially when the rot is deep, hidden beneath a beautiful facade, a place like Blackwood Ridge. For example, sometimes you have to burn it all down to save the forest." The name hit the room and dissipated, meaningless to 99% of the guests. It was just a place, a metaphor. But for Dorothy, and for the handful of people who knew, the words were not a metaphor. They were a rifle shot. The coded reference was a masterpiece of cruelty, a public execution no one else could see. He was speaking of the day her world ended, the day Robert died, the day her name was dragged through the mud and her reputation was incinerated. He was calling her husband, her life, rot. The air in her lungs turned to ice. A wave of nausea, cold and sharp, washed over her. For a moment, the opulent ballroom dissolved, replaced by a searing, vivid memory. The smell of pine and smoke, the shriek of twisting metal. Robert's voice on the phone, strained and desperate. I had to make a choice. Dottie, there was no other way. Forgive me. Then, silence. The news reports that followed were a blur of accusation and insinuation. Robert Washington, the celebrated architect, dead in a suspicious fire at his controversial Blackwood Ridge project. Whispers of financial ruin, of a desperate man taking the easy way out, of Dorothy's complicity. The stories, she would later learn, were all planted, all nurtured, all meticulously weaponized by the man now standing at the podium. The flashback was a physical blow, a ghost's hand closing around her heart. The pain was as fresh as it had been 5 years ago. But on the outside, Dorothy Washington did not flinch. She did not gasp. She did not look away. Her spine remained ramrod straight. She lifted her chin a fraction of an inch and met his gaze across the sea of oblivious faces. Her eyes, dark and unreadable, held his. There was no fear in them, no grief, only a calm, unnerving certainty. It was a look he had never seen from her before. Not during the investigation, not during the financial ruin, not during her public shaming. It was a silent, profound declaration of war. Morrison's smile faltered for the briefest of moments. He had expected her to crumble, to flee the room in tears, to give him the satisfaction of a visible wound. Her composure was an unforeseen, unwelcome variable. He quickly recovered, finishing his speech to thunderous applause, the golden boy accepting his accolades. But as he smiled and waved, his eyes kept darting back to her, to the quiet woman in the simple black dress who had just, without a single word, promised his ruin. Dorothy remained seated until the applause died down. She took a slow, deliberate sip of water, the glass steady in her hand. Then she rose, smoothed her dress, and walked out of the ballroom. Not with the hurried retreat of the wounded, but with the measured, purposeful stride of a general, leaving a battlefield to plan the next engagement. The battle was over. The war was about to begin. Dorothy's apartment was on the 4th floor of a pre-war walk-up in a quiet, forgotten corner of Queens. The contrast with the world she had just left was absolute. There was no suffocating opulence here, only the quiet dignity of a life pared down to its essentials. The small 2-bedroom space was not a home. It was a command center, a war room disguised by worn hardwood floors and the comforting scent of old books and Earl Grey tea. The living room was dominated by a large corkboard, hidden behind a simple folding screen. On it, a complex web of names, photographs, and corporate structures was mapped out with colored pins and taut strings of yarn. At the center was a smiling, public relations-approved photo of James Eagle Morrison. Radiating from it were lines connecting him to shell corporations, offshore accounts, political lobbyists, and a dozen other men in expensive suits. It was a cartography of corruption, meticulously assembled over 5 years of obsessive, silent research. Every piece of furniture served a dual purpose. The antique secretary desk held not stationery, but encrypted hard drives and files filled with financial statements. The bookshelves were lined with volumes on corporate law, forensic accounting, and military strategy. Sun Tzu sat beside SEC filings. This apartment was her fortress, the one place she could lower the mask of placid obscurity she wore for the outside world. Her life was a study in discipline. Mornings were for research, afternoons for analysis, and evenings for planning. Her only extravagance was a state-of-the-art encrypted computer system, purchased with the last of her liquidated assets. It was her primary weapon. She was not entirely alone in her quiet war. She had 2 allies, a small, fiercely loyal circle forged in the fires of her old life. The first was Marcus Thorne. He had been the head of security for Robert's architectural firm, a former NYPD detective with a face like a roadmap of bad neighborhoods and eyes that missed nothing. When the company collapsed, Morrison had offered him a lucrative position. Marcus had turned it down flat, choosing loyalty over a paycheck. Now, he worked as a private investigator, his skill set perfectly suited to the shadows. He was her operative on the ground, the man who could get the information that didn't exist online. The second was Sarah Jenkins, a young journalist who had been an intern at a major newspaper when Dorothy's life imploded. Assigned to write a salacious sidebar on the grieving widow, Sarah had been the only reporter to sense that the official narrative was a lie. She dug deeper, asked the wrong questions, and was promptly reassigned to covering city council meetings. The injustice had lit a fire in her. She saw in Dorothy's story the kind of systemic corruption she had entered journalism to fight. She was Dorothy's digital expert and her window into the media world. A small, framed photograph on Dorothy's bedside table was the fuel for her fire. It was of her and Robert on their wedding day, 30 years ago. He was handsome, his eyes crinkling at the corners with a smile that was genuine and full of life. She was radiant, looking at him with an expression of absolute trust. That was the man they had turned into a villain. That was the love they had branded a lie. Flashbacks came to her, not as hazy memories, but as sharp, detailed moments of a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. Sunday mornings, with Robert, curled up with the papers and coffee, his head in her lap as he read architectural blueprints, like they were poetry. The pride in his voice when he first showed her the plans for Blackwood Ridge. His passion project, an eco-friendly corporate retreat designed to harmonize with nature, not conquer it. "This is my legacy, Dottie," he had said, his eyes shining. "Something beautiful that will last." The contrast between that loving memory and the cold, calculated cruelty of Morrison's speech at the gala was a physical ache. For 5 years, her grief had been a quiet, private sanctuary. Morrison had just invaded it, desecrated it, and turned it into a weapon against her in a room full of strangers. The humiliation was the final catalyst, the spark that ignited the long, smoldering fuse. She sat at her desk, the city lights of Manhattan a distant, glittering promise across the river. She opened a secure communication line. First, she called Marcus. "He did it. Marcus," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "He said the name. In public." Marcus's voice was a low growl on the other end. "That arrogant son of a—" He caught himself. "Are you all right?" "Dorothy." "I'm fine," she said, and it was true. The shock had burned away, leaving behind a cold, hard clarity. "He's gotten comfortable. He thinks I'm broken. He thinks he's won. That's the mistake we've been waiting for." "What's the move?" Marcus asked. "Activate the first phase. I want to know everything about his Senate confirmation hearing. Who's on the committee? Who his sponsors are? Every potential vulnerability. And Marcus, I need you to find something for me. Something tangible from Blackwood Ridge. Something they missed." "I'm on it," he said without hesitation. Next, she called Sarah. The younger woman answered on the first ring. "I was watching the live stream," Sarah said, her voice tight with anger. "I can't believe he did that. The nerve of that man." "Arrogance is a fatal flaw." "Sarah," Dorothy replied calmly, "he's about to be nominated for Secretary of Commerce. His entire life is about to go under a microscope. I need you to start laying the groundwork. Not with our story, with his other victims. I've sent you 3 files. The pension fund he raided in Ohio, the small tech company he bankrupted in Austin, the families in Pennsylvania whose water was poisoned by one of his factories. I want you to find the human cost. Give them a voice." Softening the ground before the main assault, Sarah said, the strategic language coming naturally to her now. Precisely, Dorothy said. He's built a myth around himself as a man of the people, a soldier billionaire. It's time to show the world the bodies he buried to build his empire. After the calls, Dorothy stood and walked to the corkboard. She took a single red pin and pushed it firmly into the center of James Morrison's smiling face. For 5 years. She had been a widow in exile. For 5 years. She had been a ghost. That part of her life was over. It's time. Robert, she whispered to the empty room. It's time to clear away the deadwood. The gala was the desecration. The planning was the response. The moment Dorothy committed, fully and irrevocably, was a quiet affair, marked by none of the evening's drama. It happened the following morning, as the pale light of dawn filtered through her apartment window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. She sat at her kitchen table, a simple cup of tea steaming in her hands, her gaze fixed on the corkboard, now exposed in the morning light. The intricate web of connections was no longer just an academic exercise in mapping her enemy's kingdom. It was now a battlefield. Every string was a potential line of attack, every pin a target. The humiliation at the gala had not broken her. It had galvanized her. It had stripped away the last vestiges of her grief-induced paralysis and replaced it with a singular, diamond-hard purpose. This was no longer just about clearing Robert's name or reclaiming her own life. Morrison's public taunt had made it clear that he was still actively harming people, still building his empire on the ruins of others, and using his carefully constructed hero persona as a shield. Exposing him was no longer just a personal quest for vengeance. It was a public service. She picked up the phone and dialed a number she knew by heart. It was her former financial advisor, a man who had managed her and Robert's fortune for 2 decades before it was all wiped out in the aftermath of Blackwood Ridge. He was a good man, but a timid one. "Arthur, it's Dorothy Washington." There was a nervous cough on the other end. "Dorothy Howe. How are you?" "I need a favor," she said, dispensing with pleasantries. "I need you to liquidate the annuity. All of it." The annuity was the last piece of her old life. A small, protected fund Robert had set up for her years ago. The only asset Morrison's legal vultures hadn't been able to touch. It was her safety net. The modest monthly payments just enough to cover her rent and utilities. Cashing it out was an act of financial suicide, burning her only lifeboat. "Dorothy, I can't advise you to do that," Arthur stammered. "That's your security. Once it's gone." "I'm aware of the risks, Arthur," she said, her voice level and calm. "This is not a financial decision. It's a strategic one. I need the capital for an investment. Please, just do it." The silence on the other end stretched, filled with his anxiety. Finally, he sighed. "As you wish. Dorothy, the papers will be ready for your signature this afternoon." Hanging up the phone, she felt a profound sense of release. She had severed the final tie to her past, to the woman who waited and grieved. She was now fully committed, an army of one with a newly funded war chest. She returned to her desk and opened a new encrypted file on her computer. The file was named Operation Nightingale, a name she'd chosen for its bitter irony. Nightingale sang most beautifully in the dark. It was a multi-phased plan, the culmination of her 5 years of research. Phase 1. The Foundation, using Sarah's journalistic skills. They would begin seeding stories about Morrison's lesser-known business dealings. They would focus on the victims, not him. The retired factory workers in Ohio, the family-run businesses crushed by his predatory tactics. The goal was to subtly chip away at the foundation of his public image, creating tiny cracks in the myth of the benevolent hero. Phase 2. The flank. With the capital from her annuity, Marcus would discreetly acquire small, strategic parcels of debt from companies on the brink of collapse due to Morrison's hostile maneuvers. He would also establish a network of informants within Morrison's vast corporate empire, disgruntled accountants, passed-over executives, administrative assistants who saw too much. This was the intelligence-gathering phase, designed to find the structural weaknesses in his organization. Phase 3. The assault. This was the final, direct confrontation. The evidence gathered in the previous phases would be consolidated into an undeniable, irrefutable dossier. It would be deployed at a moment of maximum vulnerability for Morrison, his Senate confirmation hearing. It had to be public, televised, and absolute. There could be no room for denial, no escape through legal loopholes or PR spin. She spent the rest of the day outlining the initial steps, assigning tasks to Marcus and Sarah, and allocating her new funds. There was no hesitation, no second-guessing. The cool, methodical way she organized the campaign was a testament to the woman she had become. The grief was still there, a cold stone in her chest. But it was no longer an anchor. It was a whetstone, and she had been sharpening herself on it for 5 years. That evening, Marcus and Sarah came to her apartment. They sat around her small kitchen table, the corkboard looming behind them like a silent fourth conspirator. The air was thick with a shared, unspoken gravity. This was the point of no return. "He thinks this is a game," Marcus said, his big hands wrapped around a mug of coffee. "He's been playing it his whole life. He doesn't know what he's up against." "He thinks he's fighting a ghost," Sarah added, her laptop open, already cross-referencing names from Dorothy's files. "He won't see us coming until it's too late." Dorothy looked at the two of them, her small, loyal army, a broken-down detective and a sideline journalist, against a billionaire with the world at his feet. The odds were laughable. "He made a mistake," Dorothy said softly, her eyes finding the red pin on the board. "He reminded me that I had nothing left to lose. And a woman with nothing left to lose is a woman who can risk everything." She raised her teacup. "To Robert." "To Robert," Marcus and Sarah echoed, raising their mugs. The war had been declared at the gala. It was in this small Queen's apartment, with a quiet toast and a finalized plan, that the first shots were truly fired. The initial days of Operation Nightingale were deceptively quiet. Sarah began feeding leads to a trusted colleague at an independent news outlet, a blogger known for his deep dives into corporate malfeasance. The first story, a human interest piece on the plight of the Ohio pensioners, ran a week after the gala. It created a small ripple, a brief flare of outrage on social media, but it was quickly buried under the next day's news cycle. Morrison's PR machine was too powerful, his image too polished. The crack in his armor was microscopic. Dorothy's attempts to leverage her old network met a similar, more personal, wall of resistance. She placed a call to a former board member of Robert's company, a man who had once been a close family friend. "Eleanor and I were so sorry to hear about Robert," he said, his voice slick with false sympathy. "Such a tragedy." "I'm not calling for condolences, Frank," Dorothy said, her tone crisp. "I'm calling because I know you were forced out of the merger by Morrison. I have the documents. I need you to speak on the record." The line went cold. "I don't know what you're talking about. Dorothy, I think you're confused. Grief can do that to a person. I have to go." He hung up. She tried 3 more old contacts. The response was the same feigned ignorance, nervous excuses, or outright refusal. One woman, a lawyer whose children had grown up with hers, tearfully admitted the truth. He knows where my son goes to college. Dottie. He sent me a brochure for the university, with my son's picture circled. It wasn't a threat. Not really. It was just a reminder. A reminder that he knows everything. I'm sorry. I can't help you. Morrison hadn't just destroyed her life. He had salted the earth around her. He had systematically isolated her, cutting every cord of support, ensuring that if she ever tried to rise from the ashes, she would find herself utterly alone. It was a chillingly effective strategy. The world that had once been hers was now a hostile territory, patrolled by his influence. Then came the direct counterattack. A crisp, white envelope arrived by courier. Inside was a summons. One of Morrison's innumerable shell corporations. A company called Ridgeview Holdings, LLC, was suing her for defamation, citing a comment she had allegedly made to a caterer at the gala. The claim was absurd, baseless. But that wasn't the point. The point was the lawsuit itself. She met with a pro bono lawyer Sarah had found, a young, earnest man who looked horrified as he reviewed the paperwork. "This is a slap suit," he said, pushing his glasses up his nose. "Strategic lawsuit against public participation. It's designed to bury you in legal fees, to bleed you dry through endless depositions and discovery motions. They don't need to win. They just need to make it too expensive for you to fight." The timing was impeccable. Morrison must have known, somehow, that she had accessed her annuity. The lawsuit was designed to devour her entire war chest before she could even begin to deploy it. It was a preemptive strike of masterful precision. That night, the weight of her decision pressed down on her. The faces of her former friends, twisted with fear. The cold, legal language of the summons. The dwindling number in her bank account as she paid the lawyer's initial retainer. The scale of Morrison's power was immense, his reach seemingly limitless. Doubt, a cold and creeping vine, began to curl around her heart. Was this hopeless? Was she just a moth throwing itself against a searchlight? She stood before the corkboard, the web of strings and pins seeming less like a battle plan and more like a testament to her own futility. Morrison wasn't just an enemy. He was an ecosystem, self-sustaining and ruthlessly efficient at expelling any foreign body. The encrypted phone buzzed on her desk. It was Marcus. "Bad news," he said, his voice gravelly. "I've been made. 2 of Morrison's guys, ex-military, have been tailing me since yesterday. Clean, professional. They're not trying to be subtle. It's a message." The message was clear. "I see you. I see all of you." The walls were closing in. Her allies were compromised. Her resources were under attack. And her old world had firmly shut its doors to her. Morrison had anticipated her every move. This was his game. And he was playing it on a level she hadn't fully comprehended. The first obstacle wasn't just a hurdle. It was a fortress wall. And she had just run into it at full speed, for the first time since the gala. Dorothy felt a tremor of fear, not for herself, but for the people she had pulled into this fight with her. The lawsuit was a cage, but Dorothy refused to rattle its bars. Instead of panicking, she adapted. The initial plan was too direct, too conventional. Morrison was a master of that game. She needed to change the rules. "We're not going to fight the lawsuit," she told Marcus and Sarah during an emergency meeting in her apartment, the blinds drawn tight. "We are going to ignore it. Let them file motions. Let their lawyers bill them for empty hours. We're going underground." Her apartment was no longer safe. Marcus arranged for a new base of operations, a dusty, forgotten office above a laundromat in Brooklyn, rented under a false name. It was cramped, anonymous, and perfect. They moved the corkboard and her computer system in the dead of night. The war had officially gone covert. With her funds dwindling under the pressure of legal fees, Dorothy pivoted her strategy from large-scale maneuvers to surgical strikes. She gave Marcus a new mission. "Forget his legitimate businesses," she instructed. "I want you to find the connections he thinks are buried forever, the ones that aren't on any paperwork." Marcus, a man who thrived in the shadows, relished the new challenge. He stopped trying to interview ex-employees and started spending his nights in dive bars near Morrison's less reputable shipping facilities. He didn't ask questions. He listened. He bought drinks for disgruntled foremen and longshoremen, speaking their language of frustration and quiet resentment. He became a ghost in their world, just another face nursing a cheap beer. Slowly, the whispers began. Tales of cargo containers that were never inspected, of manifests that didn't match the inventory. He heard a name repeated in hushed, fearful tones: the Vipers. They weren't a company. They were a crew. Morrison's unofficial enforcement arm, composed primarily of ex-Special Forces soldiers from his old unit. They were the ones who handled the Deadwood clearing on a more literal level union organizers who suddenly disappeared. Journalists who got too curious and ended up in the hospital after a mugging. This was Morrison's veteran network. But it wasn't a brotherhood of support. It was a private army, bound by loyalty to their former commander and operating completely outside the law. Marcus began to meticulously document their activities, cross-referencing names with flight manifests and police reports. A dark, violent picture began to emerge, far from the polished image of the philanthropic war hero. Meanwhile, Sarah changed her own tactics. The mainstream media was a fortress she couldn't breach, so she went smaller, deeper. She started a blog under a pseudonym, The Corporate Ghost. She didn't write about Morrison directly. Instead, she wrote detailed, deeply researched case studies of corporate predation. Her third post was about a small, family-owned logistics company in New Jersey that had been driven into bankruptcy by a larger, unnamed competitor who had systemically poached their clients, sabotaged their trucks, and tied them up in frivolous litigation. The details were precise, the human cost heartbreaking. She never mentioned Morrison's name, but for anyone in the industry, the playbook was unmistakable. The blog gained a small but dedicated following of industry insiders, academics, and other victims of corporate warfare. In the comments section, people began sharing their own stories, naming other companies, other predators. Sarah had created a safe space for the silenced, a digital support group that was slowly building a mountain of anecdotal evidence. Dorothy became the central node, the spy master in their cramped Brooklyn office. She took the raw data from Marcus and the narratives from Sarah and began weaving them together. She spent her days in the New York Public Library, digging through microfiche archives, pulling property records and old newspaper articles, connecting the Vipers' movements to Morrison's corporate acquisitions. She discovered a pattern. Before every hostile takeover, a key executive at the target company would suffer a personal tragedy, a car accident, a house fire, a sudden tax audit. These incidents were always dismissed as random misfortunes. But when cross-referenced with Marcus's intel on the Vipers' locations, the randomness disappeared. It was a campaign of systematic terror, designed to destabilize a company from the inside before Morrison's legal team swept in to pick up the pieces. The pressure from Morrison's side never let up. The tail on Marcus became more aggressive. Sarah's laptop was remotely wiped, forcing her to work exclusively on air-gapped machines. Dorothy's own small apartment was broken into, a clumsy, amateurish job not meant to steal anything, but to send a message of violation, of vulnerability. They left a single white feather, a symbol of cowardice, on her pillow. It was a classic psychological warfare tactic. meant to intimidate and unnerve. Instead, it hardened her resolve. She saw the feather not as an insult, but as a sign of desperation. The great James Eagle Morrison was being forced to use street-level intimidation tactics against a 60-year-old widow. He was feeling the pressure. The microscopic cracks were widening. The breakthrough came from one of Marcus's late-night listening sessions. A drunk, embittered accountant, recently fired from one of Morrison's subsidiary firms, let slip a crucial detail. He spoke of a separate, off-the-books accounting system, a digital ledger that handled Morrison's special projects. He called it the Nightingale File. The name struck Dorothy like a physical blow. It was the same name she had chosen for her own operation. It couldn't be a coincidence. It was a word that connected her, Morrison, and the tragedy at Blackwood Ridge. The accountant didn't know how to access it, but he knew one thing: it was managed by Morrison's most trusted aide, a woman named Evelyn Reed, his chief financial officer and, according to rumor, the only person he truly trusted. Evelyn Reed. A new primary target appeared on the corkboard. Getting to that ledger, to the Nightingale File, became their singular obsession. It was the key, the Rosetta Stone that could decipher the entirety of Morrison's criminal enterprise. The hunt was on, and the stakes had just been raised exponentially. Evelyn Reed was a fortress. She was in her late 50s, a woman who had risen in the brutal world of corporate finance through sheer, unadulterated competence. Her life was a closed loop, a high-security apartment on Park Avenue, a chauffeured car to Morrison's glass and steel headquarters, and 12-hour workdays. She had no family, no social media presence, and no apparent weaknesses. For weeks, Marcus's surveillance turned up nothing. She was a ghost who left no tracks. Dorothy knew a direct approach was impossible. A fortress like Evelyn Reed couldn't be taken by force. It had to be opened from the inside. "We don't need to break her," Dorothy told the team. "We just need to find the key." The key, she suspected, wasn't a vice or a secret. It was a memory. Dorothy spent days combing through archives, searching for anything on Evelyn's life before she joined Morrison 20 years ago. She found it in a yellowed announcement from a small-town Pennsylvania newspaper, a notice for the high school debate club championship. The winner was Evelyn Reed. The topic of the debate was corporate ethics. Armed with this tiny sliver of insight, Dorothy shifted her strategy. This wasn't a job for Marcus's grit or Sarah's digital prowess. This required a woman's touch. Her touch. Dorothy began to subtly insert herself into Evelyn's world. She started attending a weekly chamber music concert at a small conservatory near Evelyn's apartment, a concert she knew from her research that Evelyn never missed. For 3 weeks, Dorothy simply sat a few rows behind, observing. On the 4th week, she accidentally dropped her program in the aisle as Evelyn was leaving. "Oh, allow me," Evelyn said, her voice as crisp and precise as her tailored suit. She bent to retrieve it. "Thank you so much," Dorothy said, meeting her eyes with a warm, genuine smile. "I'm so clumsy these days." "Not at all," Evelyn replied, her gaze lingering on Dorothy's face for a moment, a flicker of curiosity in her otherwise guarded eyes. "The Bach was exquisite tonight, wasn't it?" "It truly was," Dorothy agreed. "It reminds me of a time when things felt clearer." It was a small, seemingly insignificant encounter, but it was a seed. The next week, they exchanged brief pleasantries. The week after, they had a short conversation about the cellist's performance. Dorothy never mentioned her name. She was just a quiet, elegant woman who shared a love for classical music. She was unthreatening, a person from a different world. The real move came a month into their silent acquaintance. Sarah, through her anonymous blog, published her most powerful story yet. It was the detailed account of how a charitable foundation for veterans' families had its endowment wiped out by a series of predatory short sales, traced back to an anonymous hedge fund. The story was heartbreaking, filled with quotes from widows and children who had lost their only source of support. Sarah, using Dorothy's files, made sure the trading patterns described in the article were an exact mirror of a recent, highly profitable move made by a Morrison-owned fund. That evening, at the conservatory, Dorothy saw Evelyn staring at her phone before the concert began, her face pale, her knuckles white as she gripped the device. During intermission, Dorothy found her in the lobby. "Is everything all right?" Dorothy asked, her voice filled with gentle concern. "You seem distressed." Evelyn looked up, startled. "It's just a disturbing story I was reading, about a veterans foundation." Dorothy nodded slowly. "I think I read the same one. The corporate ghost, wasn't it? It's just awful. To prey on the families of those who have served. It's a special kind of evil, isn't it? It takes a person with no soul." She looked directly into Evelyn's eyes, and, for the first time, she saw a crack in the fortress. She saw the young debate champion from Pennsylvania, the girl who had once passionately argued for corporate ethics. "My late husband, he served," Dorothy said softly, letting that one personal detail hang in the air. "I can't imagine what those families are going through." She then walked away, leaving Evelyn alone with her thoughts. She had not accused. She had commiserated. She had aligned herself with Evelyn's conscience. 2 days later, an anonymous, encrypted email arrived in Sarah's inbox for the corporate ghost. It contained a single attachment. It was a heavily firewalled, password-protected file. The body of the email contained only a string of numbers. It took Sarah and a freelance cryptographer 2 days to break it. When the file opened, they weren't just looking at financial crimes. It was Morrison's private ledger, the Nightingale file. It was a meticulous record of every bribe, every act of blackmail, every intimidation tactic. But as Dorothy scrolled through the entries, her blood ran cold. She saw the payments to discredit news agencies, the funds allocated to the Vipers, the money trail that led directly to the ruin of her own life. And then she saw the section on Blackwood Ridge. It wasn't a business entry. It was a personal journal. There were no references to Robert taking his own life. Instead, there were cryptic notes. R.W. cornered. Forced his hand. Nightingale protocol initiated. And then, the entry that changed everything. It was a note from the day after the fire. A single sentence written by Morrison himself. "He made his choice, just like my father did. He chose her over duty. And now she will pay the same price my mother paid." Dorothy stared at the words, her mind struggling to comprehend the implication. Morrison's father, his mother. She cross-referenced the date with her own research. Morrison's father, a decorated Army colonel, had died by suicide 25 years ago after a disastrous military procurement deal he was supervising went public, bankrupting his family and destroying his reputation. And the procurement deal was with Robert Washington's first architectural firm. The pieces slammed into place with dizzying, sickening force. Morrison didn't hate Robert. He hated her. He believed Robert had been forced into a corner by a bad deal, and, instead of taking the honorable way out and facing ruin alone, had made a choice that led to the Blackwood Ridge tragedy, a choice Morrison blamed on Dorothy's influence. He saw Dorothy as the catalyst for Robert's downfall, just as he believed his own mother had been the catalyst for his father's. His entire epic revenge was not about business, or greed, or even Robert. It was a twisted, personal vendetta against her, a horrifying reenactment of his own family tragedy. She scrolled further and found a scanned image in the file. It was a small, silver locket, a locket she recognized instantly. Robert had given it to her on their 5th anniversary. It had been lost in the fire at Blackwood Ridge. Morrison had kept it as a trophy. The room began to spin. This wasn't a fight over a company. This was a war over a ghost story, a toxic obsession that had festered in Morrison's mind for decades. He wasn't just destroying her future. He was trying to rewrite his own past, with her cast as the villain. The revelation was staggering, and it made her enemy infinitely more dangerous. He wasn't just ruthless. He was a man driven by a profound, personal, and utterly warped sense of justice. The discovery of Morrison's true motive changed the temperature of the war from cold to freezing. He wasn't a rational actor who could be beaten with logic and evidence alone. He was a zealot on a holy crusade. Dorothy knew he would not stop, and now that they had his ledger, he would sense their proximity and escalate. He did. The retaliation was swift, brutal, and aimed not at Dorothy, but at the pillars supporting her. Sarah was the first to fall. She arrived at her office one morning to find her editor and 2 HR representatives waiting for her. On the editor's desk was a printout of an article from a rival newspaper, published under Sarah's byline 5 years ago. Beside it was an almost identical article from a small university journal, published a week earlier. It was irrefutable proof of plagiarism. "I didn't write this," Sarah insisted, her face ashen as she looked at the article bearing her name. "This isn't mine. My byline has been faked." Her editor, a man who had once been her mentor, wouldn't meet her eyes. "The digital footprint is there. Sarah, our IT department confirmed it. I'm sorry. We have to let you go." It was a digital deepfake, a sophisticated forgery impossible for her to disprove. Morrison hadn't just gotten her fired. He had destroyed her career, branding her with the one unforgivable sin in journalism. She was professionally executed, her credibility shot. Next came Marcus. He was meeting a source in a coffee shop when 2 plainclothes detectives approached his table. "Marcus Thorne, you're under arrest." The charge was illegal wiretapping and corporate espionage. The evidence was an anonymous tip and a doctored audio file, supposedly of Marcus trying to bribe an employee of a Morrison-owned company. It was a frame job, slick and professional. Marcus knew the game. He knew how long it would take to unravel a charge like this, and how much it would cost. He was taken out of play, buried in the cogs of the very legal system he had once served. Dorothy was now completely isolated. Her army was gone. Her allies were broken. And then Morrison turned his full attention to her. He didn't use the Vipers, or send another feather. He used the weapon he wielded best: the media. He granted an exclusive, primetime interview to the country's most respected television journalist. He sat in a comfortable armchair, his expression a mask of pained nobility, and told a story. He spoke of his deep respect and friendship for the late Robert Washington, painting him as a brilliant but troubled man. He spoke of Robert's financial desperation, of his erratic behavior in the months leading up to the fire. And then, with tears in his eyes, he delivered the killing blow. He spoke of Dorothy. "Robert loved her," Morrison said, his voice thick with feigned sorrow. "But she was ambitious. She pushed him. She couldn't accept a life without the galas, the status. When his firm began to struggle, she put incredible pressure on him. He was trying to protect her, to give her the life she demanded." He paused, letting the implication hang in the air. The tragedy at Blackwood Ridge. I believe Robert felt trapped. He saw no other way out. And Dorothy. I think she has been consumed by her guilt ever since. She has built this fantasy, this conspiracy, where I am somehow to blame. It's a way of avoiding her own role in the tragedy. It's sad. Truly. I've tried to help her, but she sees me as the enemy. I pray she finds peace. It was a work of art. In 10 minutes, he had taken the truth and twisted it into a new, compelling narrative. He wasn't the villain. He was the compassionate friend, worried for the mental stability of a grieving, guilt-ridden widow. He recast her righteous anger as delusion, her quest for justice as a pathological vendetta. The public bought it completely. The story exploded. News outlets, smelling blood in the water, began digging into Dorothy's reclusive life. Anonymous sources former friends Morrison had coerced spoke of her erratic behavior after Robert's death. She was no longer a tragic widow. She was an unhinged harpy. A modern-day Miss Havisham consumed by a paranoid fantasy. Public opinion, which had been apathetic, now turned viciously against her. She was besieged. Reporters camped outside her Queens apartment building. Her photo was on the cover of tabloids. The comments on the news articles were a torrent of vitriol. She was alone, discredited, and publicly crucified. Morrison had not just built a fortress wall. He had turned the entire world against her. He had taken her pain, her grief, her love for Robert, and used it to paint her as a monster. It was his most profound act of cruelty, a psychological blow designed to shatter her completely. Huddled in the anonymous Brooklyn office, the city lights seeming to mock her from across the river, Dorothy looked at the corkboard. Her allies' pictures were now marked with red X's. Her own name was at the center of a new web, one of public scorn and ridicule. She had the truth. The Nightingale file was sitting on an encrypted drive on her desk, but the truth was useless. Who would believe her now? She had the weapon, but he had destroyed the archer. This was the second obstacle, and it felt like the end of the war. Morrison hadn't just defeated her, he had erased her. The C-SPAN cameras broadcast the scene in sterile, unflinching detail. The Senate Commerce Committee hearing room was a study in beige and gravitas, the air thick with the self-importance of power. At the central table sat James Eagle Morrison, the picture of calm confidence. He was flanked by a team of lawyers, his handsome face arranged into an expression of humble readiness to serve. His confirmation as the next Secretary of Commerce was considered a foregone conclusion. His testimony had been flawless, a masterclass in weaving together patriotism, business acumen, and a deep, folksy charm. The committee chairman, a senator who had benefited greatly from Morrison's campaign contributions, was wrapping up. This committee has been thoroughly impressed by your testimony, Mr. Morrison. Before we move to a vote, we will open the floor for a brief period of public comment. It was a formality, a perfunctory nod to democratic process. A single hand rose in the back of the crowded room. It belonged to a woman in a simple gray suit, her hair pulled back neatly. She held a press pass. The chairman sighed, impatient. The chair recognizes Ms. Evelyn Price, representing the Fiscal Policy blog. The Ledger. It was Dorothy. Her new identity was a fiction, a ghost created by a now disgraced Sarah Jenkins, who had called in one last favor from a sympathetic contact to secure the press pass. Her appearance was a quiet transformation. She had lost the look of a victim. Her face was calm, her eyes clear and focused. She looked like what she had become, a weapon. A low murmur went through the room as she approached the public microphone. In the front row, Morrison's eyes widened slightly. The smug amusement on his face was replaced by a flicker of confusion. Then annoyance. He whispered to his lawyer, who shrugged. What could she possibly do? She was a discredited madwoman, Dorothy placed a slim folio on the lectern and adjusted the microphone. Her voice, when she spoke, was not the fiery tone of an accuser, but the measured, precise cadence of a university lecturer. Good afternoon, Senators. My name is Dorothy Washington. The room fell silent. The senators looked up from their papers. Morrison's jaw tightened. I am the widow of Robert Washington, a name Mr. Morrison has invoked in his narrative of compassionate friendship. I am here today, not to speak of my grief, but to present evidence directly relevant to Mr. Morrison's fitness to hold public office. This evidence demonstrates a pattern of financial crimes, corporate espionage, and violent intimidation that makes him not a servant of the public, but its predator. The chairman banged his gavel. Mrs. Washington, this is not the forum for personal grievances. If you have a complaint— I have a complaint. Senator, Dorothy interrupted, her voice gaining a hard edge of authority that commanded attention. It is with the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Department of Justice, and the IRS, all of whom will be receiving copies of this file. But I believe you, the people's representatives, should see it first. She turned to the screen behind the committee. If the clerk could please display the contents of this flash drive. File name, Ohio Pension. Here you will see irrefutable proof of wire fraud, showing how Morrison Industries used an offshore entity to short the stock of a manufacturing company, bankrupting it and subsequently looting its pension fund. A fund, I might add, that supported over 800 families. An image of complex financial data filled the screen. Morrison's lead lawyer shot to his feet. Objection. This is unsubstantiated. Is it Dorothy's voice cut through his? Then perhaps you can explain the email on screen now. From Mr. Morrison to his hedge fund manager, in which he says, and I quote, "Bleed the old fools dry. It's a mercy killing for a dying industry." The timestamp on that email corresponds to the exact hour the final, fatal trade was made. A wave of shock rippled through the room. The flash of news cameras became a strobe-like frenzy. Aides began whispering frantically to their senators. Dorothy moved on, relentless. Next file, Viper Logistics. Here is a sworn affidavit from a former member of Mr. Morrison's security detail, a decorated veteran who will testify that he was ordered to systematically sabotage the fleet of a rival logistics company, leading to 3 non-fatal but serious accidents. His orders came directly from Mr. Morrison, who referred to it as aggressive market disruption. Morrison's face had paled. The mask of calm was cracking, revealing the furious panic beneath. He was shaking his head, a silent, desperate denial. Dorothy's voice remained even, her presentation chillingly methodical. She laid out case after case, each supported by an undeniable document. An email, a piece of irrefutable data from the Nightingale file. She exposed the frame-up of Marcus Thorne. She exposed the digital forgery that had destroyed Sarah Jenkins's career. She was dismantling his empire, brick by bloody brick, on national television. These are not the actions of a captain of industry, she said, her gaze locking with Morrison's. They are the actions of a crime boss. Then she delivered the masterstroke. But the question remains, why? Why such a pattern of cruelty? The answer is not in these financial records. It is in Mr. Morrison's own deeply personal history. She signaled to the clerk. Final file, Blackwood. An audio file began to play. The sound of crackling fire filled the hearing room. Then, a man's voice, strained and panicked. It was Robert. James, you can't do this. There are people still in the North Wing. You have to call it off. Then, another voice, younger, colder. It was James Morrison. Your people are collateral damage. Robert, your bad deal with my father's company cost my family everything. This is the price. You can try to save them, or you can save yourself. You can't do both. A moment of silence. Then Robert's voice, filled with anguish. Dottie, forgive me. Then, a click, as if a phone was being disconnected. The recording was damning. It proved Morrison was at Blackwood Ridge. It proved he had engineered the disaster as an act of revenge. It proved he had murdered Robert Washington. But Dorothy wasn't finished. This was her moment of truth. The secondary twist that would cost her as much as it cost him. Play the next segment, she commanded, her voice trembling for the first time. The audio continued. It was a second call Robert made. Seconds after the first, his voice was rushed, desperate. Marcus, it's Robert. Listen to me. The deal is bad. The materials are compromised. I signed off on them to save the firm. I thought I could fix it later. I was wrong. Get everyone out. Now. Tell Dorothy. Tell her the locket is in the safe. Tell her I'm sorry. The room was utterly, deathly silent. In that final, desperate confession, Dorothy had laid everything bare. To prove Morrison's guilt, she had been forced to reveal her husband's secret. Robert wasn't a perfect hero. He was a good man who had made a terrible, morally gray choice under pressure. A choice to use substandard materials to save his company. A choice that had given Morrison the leverage he needed to set his trap. Dorothy stood before the committee, exposed and vulnerable, having sacrificed the idealized memory of the man she loved to achieve her victory. She had not just exposed a villain. She had revealed a human tragedy in all its complicated, painful truth. She looked at James Morrison. His face was a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. His composed facade was completely shattered. He looked like what he was, a man whose ghosts had finally caught up with him. The chairman, his face ashen, banged the gavel weakly. This hearing is suspended. It was over. The cameras flashed. The room erupted into chaos. But Dorothy saw none of it. She saw only the truth, finally dragged into the light, and felt the immense, terrible weight of its cost. The aftermath was a hurricane. Morrison's nomination wasn't just withdrawn. It was incinerated on the pyre of public opinion. He was arrested leaving the Senate building, his perp walk broadcast on a live news feed that went viral around the world. The myth of James Eagle Morrison was dead, replaced by the reality of a vindictive murderer and a corporate predator. Federal investigations were launched. Lawsuits from dozens of his victims began to pile up. The empire he had built on secrets and violence began to crumble. Dorothy did not stay to watch. As chaos engulfed the hearing room, she slipped out a side door and took a taxi back to the anonymous Brooklyn office, the sounds of the city fading into a dull hum. She did not feel triumphant. She did not feel victorious. She felt hollowed out, scoured clean by the truth. She sat in the dim, dusty room, the corkboard map of her war now looking like a relic from another lifetime. The pain of revealing Robert's secret was a fresh, gaping wound. For 5 years, she had clung to the memory of his perfection. It had been her shield, her reason. In the end, to win the war, she had been forced to lay down that shield and admit that he was flawed, human, and had made a devastating mistake. The victory felt like a kind of defeat. The door creaked open. Marcus came in, followed by Sarah. He was out on bail, his name already cleared by the fallout from the hearing. The plagiarism charge against Sarah had been exposed as a fabrication, and she had 3 job offers from major networks, but they weren't here to celebrate. They didn't speak. Sarah simply went to the small kitchenette and made a pot of tea. Marcus pulled up a chair and sat beside Dorothy, his presence a silent, solid pillar of support. Sarah brought 3 mugs, and they sat together in the quiet, sipping the hot liquid as the sirens of the city wailed in the distance. "You did it, Dorothy," Marcus finally said, his voice rough with emotion. She shook her head, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. "What did I do to him?" "Marcus," to Robert's memory. "You told the truth," Sarah said softly, her own eyes shining. "All of it. You didn't just expose a monster. You honored your husband by refusing to tell a simpler, easier lie. You showed the world he was a man, a good man who made a bad choice under impossible pressure. That's more real, and more honorable, than any perfect myth." Dorothy looked at them, her 2 soldiers, her broken but loyal army. They had been through the fire with her, and they were still here. They were her family now. A new family forged not by blood, but by a shared fight for a difficult truth. "He deserved better," Dorothy whispered. "We all do," Marcus said, placing a large, comforting hand on her shoulder. "Now, thanks to you, a lot of people might actually get it." She spent the next few weeks in self-imposed exile, avoiding the news, ignoring the calls from publishers and movie producers. She grieved. She grieved for Robert as he truly was, not as she had needed him to be. She grieved for the woman she had been, the one who believed in simple truths and happy endings. And she grieved for the person she had to become to survive a cold, meticulous strategist who had weaponized her own pain. One rainy Tuesday, a package arrived. It contained a single, small silver locket, recovered by the FBI from Morrison's effects. It was tarnished and slightly dented, but intact. She clicked it open. Inside were the 2 tiny, faded photos, one of her, one of a young Robert, both smiling. It was the last piece of her old life. Returned. Holding it, she felt not the sharp pain of loss, but a quiet, aching sense of peace. The past was finally where it belonged. It was time to build a future. 6 months later, Dorothy Washington stood not in a sterile hearing room or a dusty Brooklyn office, but in a clean, brightly lit space in a modest downtown building. The frosted glass on the door read, in simple, elegant letters, "The Washington Foundation for Corporate Accountability." The foundation, funded by the substantial settlement from her countersuit against Morrison's collapsed empire, had a clear and simple mission to provide legal and financial aid to the victims of corporate crime. It was not an act of revenge, but of restoration. She was not tearing down. She was building up. Her life had found a new rhythm. She still lived in her small Queens apartment, but it was no longer a war room. The corkboard was gone, replaced by a beautiful landscape painting. Marcus worked as the Foundation's chief investigator, using his skills to vet cases and protect their clients from intimidation. Sarah served as the communications director, using her restored platform to give a voice to the voiceless. They were a formidable team, healing the wounds that men like Morrison inflicted on the world. One afternoon, while finally packing up the last of Robert's old things from a storage unit, she found a small, metal lockbox she'd never seen before, tucked away at the bottom of a crate of his old architectural books. It was cold to the touch. The key was taped to the bottom. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside, there was no money, no hidden documents. There was only a single, sealed envelope with her name on it, written in Robert's familiar, elegant script. It was dated the day before the fire at Blackwood Ridge. With a deep breath, she opened it. "My dearest Dottie, if you are reading this, it means I have failed, not just as a husband, but as a man. I am in a terrible position, caught between a mistake I made long ago and a man who has come to collect on it. His name is James Morrison. His father was ruined by a deal our firm made, and I see now that his son believes I am solely to blame. He has found the leverage he needs, my foolish, prideful decision to use the substandard materials, and he is going to destroy me with it. He has given me a choice ruin, or a way out that protects you. He is a predator. Dottie. And I walked into his trap. There is no right answer, only a series of less terrible wrongs. Whatever happens tomorrow, please know that every decision I have ever made, right or wrong, was guided by my love for you. You were my true north. Do not let them define me by my worst moment. And please, do not let this destroy you. Live. Be happy. You have a strength in you that you don't even recognize. Use it. Build something good from these ashes. The locket is in the safe. It always pointed me home to you. All my love, forever. Robert. The letter was a gift. It was the final, missing piece. A voice from the past that granted her not just forgiveness, but permission. Permission to move on, to live, to build. He had known, in the end, what she would have to face. He had known her strength better than she knew it herself. The tears she shed were not of grief, but of profound, cleansing release. The next day, she had her first official meeting at the foundation. A young couple sat nervously across the desk from her. Their family had lost their entire life savings in the Ohio pension fund collapse that Morrison had engineered. They were the first people her foundation would help. Dorothy looked at them, saw the familiar fear and uncertainty in their eyes, and she smiled. It was a genuine smile, warm and full of a hard-won peace. "Tell me everything," she said, her voice calm and strong. "We're going to make this right." She was no longer a ghost, a victim, or a warrior. She was a builder, standing on the foundations of a painful past, creating a legacy of hope. Her quiet war was over, but her true work had just begun.